Eleanor Washington gripped the steering wheel of her rented Lexus as she drove past the Welcome to Oak Ridge Springs sign. After 20 years away building her financial empire in Chicago, she was finally back in her hometown. But this wasn't a nostalgia trip. Eleanor had a plan 2 years in the making, and today was the day it would begin. She slowed down as she approached Heartland National Bank, an imposing stone building dominating the town's main street. The sight of it made her stomach tighten. How many times had she walked through those heavy doors as a child, holding her grandmother Ida's hand? "You belong anywhere your feet take you, Eleanor," Grandma Ida would say. "Even if some folks think you don't." Eleanor parked across the street and watched people entering and exiting the bank. Somewhere inside was Richard Harrington, the man responsible for the darkest chapter of her family's life. He wouldn't recognize her now, with her tailored clothes and MBA from Northwestern. But she knew exactly who he was. The memory came back sharp as a knife. 20 years ago, her father William had applied for a loan to save his struggling hardware store. It wasn't a huge amount, just enough to weather a temporary downtown caused by the new superstore opening outside city limits. Dad had a solid business plan, loyal customers, and a perfect payment history on previous loans. But Richard Harrington, then a young loan officer eager to impress his bosses, had barely glanced at her father's application before rejecting it. "I just don't see the viability here," he'd said, not even trying to hide his condescending tone. "People like you often don't understand the complexities of modern retail competition." 3 months later, the store closed. 2 weeks after that, her father suffered a fatal heart attack. The doctors called it stress-induced. Eleanor called it what it was: the direct result of a man who made decisions based on his prejudices rather than facts. Eleanor checked her watch. Her meeting with the bank's board of directors was scheduled for tomorrow, when she would officially announce Horizon Investments, her company, as the new owner of Heartland National. But today, she wanted to see firsthand how the bank operated under Richard Harrington, now the regional manager poised for a vice president position. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant in Chicago, all documents signed and filed. "Congratulations, you officially own Heartland National Bank." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. It had taken most of her personal fortune, countless sleepless nights, and a complex web of holding companies to acquire the bank without alerting Richard or the local management. Only the national board knew about the ownership change, and they'd agreed to keep it quiet until tomorrow's announcement. She stepped out of the car and took a deep breath. Instead of her usual power suit, she wore jeans, a simple blouse, and minimal jewelry. Nothing that would mark her as the financial powerhouse she'd become. "Time to see if anything's changed in 20 years, she whispered. As she crossed the street toward the bank, memories flooded back of waiting for Grandma Ida to finish her cleaning shift, of watching men in expensive suits stride confidently through the lobby while her grandmother mopped around them, invisible. Of her father, coming out dejected after his loan rejection, trying to hide his despair from his teenage daughter. Eleanor straightened her shoulders and pushed through the heavy doors. The marble floors gleamed just as she remembered, but there were new counters, new technology. And somewhere inside, Richard Harrington was about to encounter the woman whose family he had destroyed without having any idea who she really was. The game was about to begin. Eleanor stood in line at Heartland National Bank, observing everything around her. The tellers were efficient but didn't smile much. Security cameras tracked every movement. Posters advertised special rates for preferred customers with fine print that mentioned minimum balances of $250,000. When her turn came, she approached a young woman at the information desk. "I'd like to speak with someone about investment options," Eleanor said. "I've recently come into some money." The receptionist looked Eleanor up and down, taking in her simple outfit. "How much are we talking about?" "Around $500,000, Eleanor replied. The woman's eyebrows shot up. She picked up the phone. "Mr. Harrington? There's a lady here asking about investment options for a significant sum." "Yes, sir." She hung up and forced a smile. "Our regional manager will see you." He handles our high-value clients personally. Eleanor was led to a large office with a mahogany desk and wall-to-wall financial awards. Behind the desk sat Richard Harrington, barely changed from her memory except for his now silver hair and heavier build. He didn't stand when she entered. "Good morning," he said without looking up from his computer. "I understand you're interested in our premium investment packages." "Yes," Eleanor said, sitting down uninvited. "I'm looking for the best options for long-term growth." Richard finally looked at her, his eyes performing the same evaluation the receptionist had done. His smile dimmed slightly. "And you said you have how much to invest?" $500,000. He leaned back. "That's a decent start. Though our premium wealth management services typically begin at $1 million. "I see," Eleanor said. "What returns have your investment packages shown over the past 5 years?" Richard waved his hand dismissively. "Our standard packages average about 5% annually. Nothing you couldn't find with a quick Google search." Eleanor nodded. "And your fee structure?" 3% management fee, plus performance incentives." He shuffled some papers. "Look, Ms. Washington. Ms. Washington. I have several important meetings today. For someone at your level, I'd recommend our basic CD offerings. Safe, simple." Eleanor leaned forward. "Actually, I was hoping to discuss your small business loan programs too. I'm considering starting an investment advisory firm." Richard laughed. Not a chuckle, but a full laugh. Several employees glanced toward the office. "An investment firm? Based on what experience?" "I've worked in finance for 15 years, Eleanor said calmly. "And your fees seem excessive for the returns you're offering." Richard's face hardened. "Ms. Washington, perhaps you don't understand how institutions of this caliber operate. We serve clients who actually understand money." Other customers were watching now. Eleanor felt her cheeks burning but kept her voice steady. "I understand predatory fee structures when I see them." Richard stood up. "I think we're done here. The Community Credit Union on Martin Luther King Avenue might be more your speed. They handle people of your profile." "My profile?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Let's be honest," Richard said loudly enough for others to hear. "You don't look like someone who has $500,000, and you certainly don't sound like someone qualified to give financial advice." A woman gasped at a nearby desk. Richard continued, "I've seen plenty of people come in here trying to appear more sophisticated than they are. Frankly, I'm wondering if I should call security." Eleanor stood, shaking with anger and humiliation. "You'll regret this." "Is that a threat?" Richard smiled coldly. "Security, please escort this woman out. She's making threats." A security guard approached hesitantly. Before he reached her, an older woman with an assistant manager badge stepped between them. "I'll handle this, Rick," she said firmly. She gently guided Eleanor toward the door. "I'm so sorry about this. Please, let me walk you out." Outside, Eleanor took deep breaths, fighting back tears of rage. "He had no right to treat you that way," the woman said. "I'm Martha Jenkins. I worked with your grandmother Ida for years." Eleanor stared at her in shock. "Yes, I recognized you," Martha continued. "You look just like her. But I also recognized you from Financial Weekly's 40 Under 40 last year. You're Eleanor Washington of Horizon Investments. How long has he been treating people like that?" Eleanor asked. 20 years. Longer for some communities, Martha sighed. He's untouchable because he brings in wealthy clients. But between us, he's been bending rules for them too. I can help you expose him. Eleanor looked back at the bank. "Thank you, Martha. But I may have something better in mind." Eleanor paced around her hotel room, the humiliation of the afternoon still burning in her chest. The original plan had seemed so perfect, so satisfying, by the bank secretly, walk in tomorrow, announce herself as the new owner, and fire Richard Harrington on the spot. Simple revenge for what he'd done to her father and countless others. But after today, after experiencing firsthand how deeply the rot had spread, she wasn't sure that would be enough. She picked up her phone and dialed her assistant in Chicago. "Melissa, I need you to push back tomorrow's announcement. Say I've been delayed." "Is everything okay?" Melissa asked. "Actually, no. But I think it might end up better than okay if I play this right." After hanging up, Eleanor sat at the window overlooking Oak Ridge Springs. The town had changed in 20 years, new stores, new developments, but the same invisible lines still divided communities. The same power structures remained. She changed into casual clothes and drove to Oak Ridge Cemetery. With a small bouquet of daisies in hand, she made her way to her grandmother's grave. The headstone was simple: Ida Mae Washington, 1935 to 2018. She lifted as she climbed. Eleanor placed the flowers and sat on the grass. "I saw him today, Grandma. He's exactly what you always said, a man who judges books by their covers." She wiped away a tear. "I was going to just fire him and be done with it. But that's not enough, is it? That bank has been hurting people like Dad for decades." The evening breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Eleanor closed her eyes, remembering her grandmother's voice. "There's a difference between getting even and making things right, Eleanor. One feeds your pride, the other feeds your soul." Her phone rang, startling her. It was Professor James Wilson, her old finance mentor from Northwestern. "Eleanor, I just heard about your acquisition from a friend on the national board. Congratulations. Quite the coup you've pulled off." "Thanks, Professor. Actually, I could use your advice." She explained the situation, including the day's humiliating encounter. "I see," Professor Wilson said when she finished. "And you're questioning whether simple revenge is enough?" "Yes. I came here to punish the man who destroyed my father. But maybe there's a bigger opportunity. Banking deserts are a real problem in communities like the one you grew up in," Professor Wilson said. "Predatory lending, excessive fees, loan denials to qualified applicants from certain neighborhoods, these aren't just Richard Harrington problems. They're systemic." "Exactly," Eleanor said, standing up as her mind raced with possibilities. "What if instead of just firing one racist banker, I transformed the entire institution? What if Heartland National became a model for community-focused banking?" "It would be challenging," Wilson cautioned. "You'd face resistance from shareholders, other executives who share Harrington's views, and competitors waiting for you to fail." "I've never backed down from a challenge," Eleanor said, new determination flowing through her. "And I've got something they don't have." "What's that?" "I know what it's like to be on both sides. I know what it's like to be denied opportunity, and I know what it takes to create it." Eleanor looked once more at her grandmother's grave. Tomorrow won't just be about taking Richard Harrington down. It'll be about lifting everyone else up. After saying goodbye to Professor Wilson, Eleanor drove to a small diner on the outskirts of town. It had been her father's favorite place, and remarkably, it was still open. She ordered his usual meatloaf and mashed potatoes and opened her laptop. Throughout the evening, she drafted a new vision for Heartland National Bank community reinvestment programs, microloan initiatives, financial literacy workshops, transparent fee structures, and hiring policies focused on diversity and local talent. At midnight, she sent the draft to Professor Wilson and a few trusted colleagues for feedback. Then she called Melissa again. "Change of plans for tomorrow. I need my white suit, not the navy one. And arrange for photographers to be present. This isn't going to be a quiet boardroom announcement. This is going to be a statement." As she drove back to her hotel, Eleanor felt something she hadn't expected, not just the satisfaction of upcoming revenge, but the excitement of creating something meaningful. Tomorrow wouldn't just be the end of Richard Harrington's career. It would be the beginning of a new chapter for Oak Ridge Springs. She fell asleep thinking not of her father's heartbreak, but of his dream to build something that would serve his community. Perhaps this bank could become that legacy, 2 decades late but right on time. The Heartland National Bank's second-floor conference room buzzed with excitement. Board members and executives chatted in small groups, everyone wondering about the mysterious emergency meeting. Richard Harrington stood near the head of the table, straightening his red power tie and checking his reflection in the window. "Any idea what this is about?" asked Bradley Thompson, the bank's chief loan officer and Richard's golf buddy. "Probably just the formal announcement of my promotion," Richard smirked. National finally realized they need someone with my vision in the VP office. The doors opened, and a team of unfamiliar lawyers and consultants filed in, setting up laptops and arranging documents. Richard frowned. This didn't look like a simple promotion announcement. "Excuse me," he approached one of the lawyers. "I'm Richard Harrington, regional manager. What exactly is happening here?" The lawyer glanced up briefly. "All will be explained when Ms. Washington arrives." Richard froze. Washington? Before he could ask more questions, the room fell silent as Eleanor Washington strode in. Gone was yesterday's casual attire, replaced by a pristine white power suit that commanded attention. Behind her, photographers and a videographer positioned themselves around the room. Richard's face drained of color as recognition dawned. "Your Eleanor Washington," she announced to the room, her voice clear and confident. CEO of Horizon Investments and, as of yesterday, the new owner of Heartland National Bank. Murmurs erupted around the room. Richard stood slack-jawed, unable to process what was happening. Eleanor took her place at the head of the table, the spot Richard had been hovering near. "Please, everyone, be seated. We have much to discuss." Richard stumbled into a chair as Eleanor addressed the room. "For those unfamiliar with Horizon Investments, we've built our reputation on identifying undervalued assets with strong community potential. Heartland National fits that description perfectly." Her eyes locked with Richard's. "Unfortunately, I've already identified some serious issues with current management practices." Richard found his voice. "Ms. Washington, if this is about yesterday, I had no idea who you were." "If I'd known that's precisely the point, Mr. Harrington," Eleanor cut him off. "You shouldn't need to know someone's net worth to treat them with basic respect." She turned to the room. "Yesterday, I visited this bank as a potential customer. I expressed interest in investing $500,000 million and exploring small business loan options." Eleanor nodded to the videographer, who projected a recording onto the wall screen. The hidden camera footage showed Richard's dismissive behavior, his condescending remarks, and his eventually calling security. The room fell deathly quiet as the video ended. Board members shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Richard's desperate gaze. "I've never been to this bank before yesterday," Eleanor continued. "Mr. Harrington didn't treat me poorly because he failed to recognize me. He treated me poorly because that's who he is and how he operates." Richard stood, sweat beading on his forehead. "This is a misunderstanding. I was having a difficult day, and you were questioning our fee structures in a confrontational manner. Customers have the right to ask questions about how their money is managed," Eleanor replied coolly. "But that's not the only issue." She opened a folder. "My team has conducted a preliminary review of lending practices under Mr. Harrington's leadership. We've found disturbing patterns of loan denials to qualified applicants from certain neighborhoods, while approving larger loans to less qualified applicants from others." "You can't possibly have reviewed all that in one day," Richard sputtered. "You're right. We've been quietly examining Heartland's practices for months as part of our due diligence. The board approved our purchase offer 2 weeks ago." Richard looked betrayed at the board members, who avoided his gaze. "Mr. Harrington, your employment at Heartland National Bank is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you to clear out your office." Richard's face contorted with rage and humiliation. "You can't do this. I've given 25 years to this bank. And in those 25 years, how many dreams did you crush because you judged people by their appearance rather than their qualifications? Eleanor asked quietly. How many Richard Harringtons are still out there, denying opportunities based on prejudice rather than performance? As security approached, Richard pointed a shaking finger at Eleanor. This is personal. I don't know what grudge you have, but this isn't just about you and me, Eleanor interrupted. This is about transforming a system. Starting today, Heartland National will reinvent itself as a true community partner. As Richard was escorted out, Eleanor addressed the remaining staff. I understand change is difficult. But those who share my vision for a more inclusive, transparent, and community-focused institution will find exciting opportunities ahead. She outlined her plans for community reinvestment, microloan programs, and revamped hiring practices. Heartland National has been taken for granted for too long, Eleanor concluded. It's time to show this community what a bank can truly be when it serves everyone. As the meeting adjourned, Martha Jenkins approached Eleanor. That was incredible. He never saw it coming. Eleanor smiled. This is just the beginning, Martha. I'm counting on good people like you to help rebuild this bank from the inside out. Eleanor's first week as owner of Heartland National was a whirlwind. She set up temporary office in Richard's former space, symbolically removing his numerous self-congratulatory plaques and awards. In their place, she hung a single-framed photo of her grandmother Ida in her cleaning uniform, standing proudly in front of the bank. Who's that? Asked Martha Jenkins during their morning meeting. My grandmother. She cleaned this building for 30 years, Eleanor replied. She never missed a day, even when she was sick. Meanwhile, the executives whose offices she cleaned never knew her name. Martha nodded thoughtfully. Things are already different around here. You can feel it. Eleanor smiled. Different, but not easy. I need your help identifying the biggest issues we need to address first. Martha pulled out a notepad. Well, there's the West Side branch that Richard was planning to close. It's the only bank branch serving a predominantly Black and Latino neighborhood. Not closing it anymore. Next, our small business loan approval rates in minority neighborhoods are abysmal. We'll fix that. What else? By lunchtime, they had compiled a comprehensive list of institutional problems that needed immediate attention. Eleanor called a staff meeting for that afternoon. Not everyone was happy with the sudden changes. As Eleanor approached the conference room, she overheard Bradley Thompson, Richard's golf buddy, talking to a group of loan officers. This diversity crusade won't last, he was saying. Head office will see the numbers drop and bring in someone who understands how banking really works. Eleanor pushed the door open. Actually, Mr. Thompson, I am the head office now. And I understand exactly how banking has been working for some people and not for others. The room fell silent as she took her place at the front. I know change is uncomfortable, Eleanor began. Some of you were close to Richard and may resent how his tenure ended. Others may worry about your own positions. She looked around the room, meeting eyes directly. Let me be clear, I'm not here to clean house indiscriminately. I'm here to clean up practices that have hurt this community. For the next hour, Eleanor outlined her vision and immediate changes. Some staff looked excited, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. Starting today, all loan applications will be reviewed using our new blind assessment protocol. Customer names and addresses will be redacted during initial review, focusing solely on financial qualifications. Bradley raised his hand. With all due respect, Ms. Washington, there are certain neighborhoods where property values and default rates are directly tied to decades of discriminatory lending practices, Eleanor finished for him. It's a cycle we're going to break, not perpetuate. Later that afternoon, Eleanor met Josiah Taylor, a young Black man who worked in the records department. He'd been at the bank for 3 years, but had repeatedly been passed over for promotion despite his finance degree. I've been organizing the old loan files, he explained, showing Eleanor his system. It makes it easier to track patterns over time. Eleanor steadied his work. You've created a database tracking loan approvals and denials by neighborhood? Josiah looked nervous. Yes, ma'am. It wasn't officially part of my job, but I noticed things that didn't seem right. This is exactly what we need, Eleanor said. Would you be interested in heading up our new community investment analysis team? Josiah's eyes widened. Seriously? I've been trying to get out of the basement for years. Well, now you have a corner office on the second floor. Starting tomorrow. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Harrington sat in his living room, a glass of scotch in his hand, watching Eleanor's interview on the local news. Heartland National Bank is beginning a new chapter, she was saying. We're committed to being a true partner to all communities in Oak Ridge Springs. Richard turned off the TV in disgust. His phone rang. It was Bradley. It's worse than we thought, Bradley said without preamble. She's implementing blind loan reviews, hiring diversity consultants, and promoting people like that kid from Records. She's going to run that bank into the ground, Richard growled. Some of the board members are already nervous about these changes. If the quarterly numbers look bad. Richard sat up straighter. Then we need to make sure they look bad, don't we? I still have friends in this town, Bradley. Important friends who do a lot of banking with Heartland. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we remind certain clients where their loyalties should lie. This diversity experiment needs to fail, and quickly. After hanging up, Richard pulled out his contact list. 25 years in banking had given him connections to every wealthy person and business owner in town. One by one, he began making calls. John? Richard Harrington. Listen, I need to talk to you about your accounts at Heartland. Things are changing there, and not for the better. As night fell, Eleanor worked late in her office, reviewing historical lending data. The patterns were even worse than she'd suspected. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called. Martha entered with 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might need this. Everyone else has gone home. Thanks, Martha. I appreciate all your help today. Martha smiled. It's exciting to see real change happening. But be careful, Richard still has powerful friends in this town. This won't be an easy fight. Eleanor nodded, gazing at her grandmother's photo. The most important fights never are. 2 weeks into Eleanor's leadership, Heartland National was showing promising signs of change. The West Side branch had been saved from closure, with plans for renovation instead. Loan applications from minority business owners were being processed at record rates. Even some of the initially skeptical employees were warming up to Eleanor's vision. Late one evening, Eleanor and Josiah were reviewing files in the records room when they made a disturbing discovery. Look at these, Josiah said, placing several folders on the table. All these applicants had similar credit scores and income levels. But the white applicants got loans with lower interest rates and better terms. Eleanor examined the documentation. This is worse than I thought. Richard wasn't just denying loans, he was systematically charging certain communities more. There's more, Josiah added, pulling out another stack. These wealthy clients received loans that violated our own lending guidelines. Excessive amounts, insufficient collateral, interest rates below our minimums. Eleanor frowned. Special treatment for special friends. Classic good old boys network. Should I compile all this for the board meeting tomorrow? Yes, but let's keep it between us for now. I need to think about how to present this. On her way out, Eleanor spotted Martha working late. She hesitated, then decided to share her findings. Martha, can I trust you with something sensitive? Martha looked up from her computer. Of course, Eleanor. Eleanor explained what she and Josiah had discovered. Martha's expression darkened as she listened. That doesn't surprise me at all, Martha said. Richard and his inner circle always took care of their friends. I'm presenting this to the board tomorrow. It won't be pretty. Martha nodded. You're doing the right thing. This bank needs a complete overhaul. After Eleanor left, Martha sat motionless at her desk for several minutes. Then she pulled out her phone and texted, "Need to see you tonight." Important. An hour later, Martha sat in a quiet booth at Sullivan's Steakhouse on the affluent north side of town. Across from her was a handsome young man in his early 30s. "Mom, what's so urgent?" he asked. "I was in the middle of case prep." "I'm sorry, David," Martha said quietly. "But this affects your father." David Harrington stiffened. Though he used his mother's maiden name professionally to avoid nepotism accusations, he was Richard's only son. A successful attorney with political ambitions, David had carefully cultivated a reputation separate from his father's banking career. "What's she planning now?" he asked. Martha hesitated. "Tomorrow at the board meeting, Eleanor is presenting evidence of discriminatory lending practices and preferential treatment for wealthy clients." David's jaw tightened. "Can she prove it?" "Yes. Josiah from records has been tracking patterns for years. It's all documented. This could lead to regulatory investigations. Criminal charges, even." David ran a hand through his hair. "Dad's reputation would be destroyed. My career could be affected by association." "I know," Martha whispered. "That's why I'm telling you." Later that night, David met his father at his home. Richard's face darkened as his son explained the situation. "She's out to ruin me," Richard hissed. "This vendetta goes beyond just taking my job." "Dad, if this goes public it won't," Richard interrupted. "Those files won't make it to the board meeting." The next morning, Eleanor arrived early to find Josiah waiting anxiously outside her office. "Someone broke into the records room last night," he said immediately. "The files we pulled, they're gone." Eleanor rushed to the records room. The lock had been jimmied open, and the specific files they'd collected were missing. "The digital copies?" Eleanor asked. "Also deleted from the server." Someone knew exactly what they were looking for. Eleanor's mind raced. Only 3 people knew about those files: you, me, and Ms. Washington. Martha appeared in the doorway, looking concerned. "Is something wrong?" "Security called me about a break-in." Eleanor studied Martha's face carefully. "Yes, some important files have gone missing. Files documenting Richard's discriminatory lending practices." "That's terrible," Martha said, her expression giving nothing away. "Do you have backups?" Before Eleanor could answer, her phone buzzed with a text. It was from her cybersecurity team in Chicago, unauthorized access to bank servers last night. "Tracing IP address now." Eleanor looked up at Martha, who was checking her own phone nervously. "Martha, I need to speak with you privately in my office." Once the door closed, Eleanor turned to face her. "Who did you tell about those files?" "I don't know what you mean," Martha stammered. "The server access came from a residential IP address on Oakwood Drive." "That's where Richard lives, isn't it?" Martha's composure cracked. "You don't understand. David is my son." Eleanor stared at her. "David? Richard's son is your son?" Martha nodded miserably. "Richard and it was years ago. We kept it quiet. David uses my maiden name, but he's worried about his career if his father faces criminal charges. So you betrayed me to protect him." Eleanor's voice was quiet but intense. "You pretended to support me while undermining everything I'm trying to accomplish." "I'm sorry," Martha whispered. "I made a terrible mistake." Eleanor walked to the window, struggling to contain her anger and disappointment. "Martha, I trusted you." "Please," Martha pleaded. "Richard threatened to expose our relationship, to ruin David's reputation. I was scared." Eleanor turned back to her. "You have a choice to make right now. Either you're with me in fixing this bank, or you're with Richard in protecting a corrupt system. There's no middle ground anymore." Martha looked down at her hands. "What will you do?" "What I came here to do," Eleanor replied. With or without your help. Eleanor faced the Heartland National Board members, keenly aware that her presentation was missing its most damning evidence. While we've identified concerning patterns in lending practices, some key documentation has been temporarily misplaced, she explained, meeting the skeptical gazes around the table. I've requested a formal audit to recreate these findings. Bradley Thompson barely concealed his smirk. Perhaps these patterns aren't as clear as you initially thought, Ms. Washington. After the meeting, Eleanor called an emergency session with her trusted team Josiah and 2 executives she'd brought from Chicago. Martha was conspicuously absent. They're working together, Eleanor said. Richard, Bradley, possibly others. Martha admitted she leaked information to Richard through their son David. David Harrington, asked Josiah. The city councilman? He goes by David Jenkins professionally, but yes, apparently he's Richard's son. The connection gives Richard access to political influence we hadn't anticipated. The bank's security chief played surveillance footage showing Martha using her key card to enter the records room at 11:42 p.m. the previous night. She copied the files before they were destroyed, Eleanor said. They wanted to know exactly what we had. Their strategy session was interrupted by Eleanor's assistant. Ms. Washington, we have a situation. 3 major commercial clients have just withdrawn their accounts. Combined value of over $12 million. By afternoon, the news worsened. 6 more corporate clients had pulled their business. All were companies with ties to Richard or his close associates. Eleanor's phone rang. It was her friend at the Federal Reserve. Eleanor, you need to know something. There's an unusual number of inquiries being made about Heartland National stability. Someone's floating rumors about liquidity issues. That's absurd, Eleanor said. We're well above all capital requirements. I believe you, but perception can become reality in banking. Just watch your back. The next morning, Eleanor arrived to find a reporter from the Oak Ridge Business Journal waiting in the lobby. Ms. Washington, we've received information that several major clients have left Heartland National due to concerns about your leadership. Care to comment? Heartland National remains financially sound, Eleanor replied carefully. Some clients may be uncomfortable with our new focus on serving all communities equally, but we're also attracting many new customers who appreciate our approach. Inside, she found Josiah looking troubled. You need to see this, he said, showing her his tablet. On it was a new website, Save Heartland Banking. The site claimed Eleanor was pushing a dangerous social agenda at the expense of sound financial practice and was soliciting signatures from concerned citizens. It went live last night, Josiah explained. Already has over 500 signatures. Eleanor scrolled through the comments. Many expressed concerns about jobs, while others contained thinly veiled racist and sexist remarks about her leadership. They're trying to create a public relations crisis, she said. Later that day, Eleanor received a call from the bank's attorney. Ms. Washington, I've just been notified that a group of minority shareholders has filed a petition questioning the legality of your acquisition. They're claiming proper procedures weren't followed. That's impossible. We followed every regulation to the letter. Nevertheless, they've requested an emergency board meeting to review the sale. Eleanor slammed her fist on the desk after hanging up. They're coming at us from all sides. Josiah nodded grimly. And it's getting worse. Look at our stock price. Heartland National shares had dropped nearly 8% since morning as rumors of instability spread. That evening, Eleanor spotted Martha entering the bank's side door. Following her instinct, Eleanor took the stairs instead of the elevator and quietly approached Martha's office. The door was ajar, and Martha was on the phone. Yes, I can get those files, Martha was saying. But I need assurances that David won't be implicated if this gets ugly. Eleanor's phone vibrated. A text from her security team, Jenkins accessing restricted files again. Proceed? Eleanor texted back, monitor only. Don't intervene yet. She continued listening. Richard, this is getting out of hand, Martha continued. Eleanor is not backing down, and these tactics are putting the bank itself at risk. Eleanor couldn't hear Richard's response, but Martha's face darkened. No, I won't do that. I agreed to provide information, not falsify documents. A pause. Threatening me won't work anymore. I have my own leverage now. After Martha hung up, Eleanor stepped into view. Martha startled. Eleanor. I was just talking to Richard, Eleanor finished. I heard enough. Martha closed her eyes briefly. It's not what you think. Really? Because it sounds like you're still working with him while pretending to have second thoughts. I'm trying to protect my son, Martha said. Richard is planning something big. He's convinced some board members that your acquisition was improper, and he's filing regulatory complaints. Why should I believe anything you say? Martha reached into her desk and pulled out a flash drive. Because I made copies of everything before I deleted the files. The original evidence of Richard's discriminatory practices, plus new documents showing his current plans. Eleanor eyed the drive suspiciously. And why would you give me this now? Because Richard just crossed a line I can't accept, Martha replied. He wants me to falsify bank records to make your leadership look financially reckless. She pushed the drive across the desk. I've made too many compromises already. I won't make that one. Eleanor picked up the drive, uncertainty written across her face. I don't expect forgiveness, Martha said quietly. But you should know what you're really up against. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. Eleanor arrived at 7, determined to review Martha's flash drive and prepare her defense. The bank was eerily quiet as she made her way to her office. As she sat at her computer, the phone rang. It was her Chicago office. Eleanor, our stock is in free fall in pre-market trading, her CFO reported. Down almost 15% already. Someone leaked to financial blogs that regulators are investigating us. It's not true, Eleanor said. Doesn't matter. The damage is happening anyway. Eleanor inserted Martha's flash drive, unsure if it was salvation or another trap. The files appeared legitimate complete records of Richard's discriminatory practices plus emails discussing the current campaign against her. There were even messages between Richard and several board members planning today's meeting. As she prepared her presentation, Eleanor's assistant rushed in. Ms. Washington, there are reporters in the lobby. And Mr. Richard Harrington just arrived with legal counsel. Eleanor's stomach dropped. He's not invited to this meeting. He says he has an injunction. When Eleanor entered the boardroom, Richard was already seated, a court order placed prominently before him. His attorney stood as Eleanor approached. Ms. Washington, we've secured a temporary restraining order questioning the legality of your acquisition. Until resolved, Mr. Harrington retains certain rights as former management. Eleanor maintained her composure. That's for the courts to decide. This is a private board meeting. Actually, said Gerald Foster, the eldest board member, we voted to allow Richard to present his concerns. Richard smiled thinly as Eleanor took her seat. She scanned the room, noting which board members avoided her eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard began smoothly, I've dedicated my life to this institution. When I learned it had been acquired under questionable circumstances by someone with a personal vendetta against me, I felt compelled to speak up. He gestured to a PowerPoint showing the bank's declining stock price. In just 3 weeks under Ms. Washington's leadership, our market value has dropped by nearly 20%. Major clients are fleeing. Community confidence is shattered. Eleanor watched the board members' reactions. Several nodded in agreement. This isn't about hurt feelings over my termination, Richard continued. This is about saving an institution that serves thousands of customers and employs hundreds of people. Richard's attorney distributed folders to each board member. What's even more troubling, Richard said, his voice dropping dramatically, is Ms. Washington's true background and motives. He clicked to a new slide showing a young Eleanor with her grandmother. Eleanor Washington portrays herself as a self-made financial genius. The truth? She's the daughter of the bank's former janitor. Murmurs rippled through the room. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with anger. There's nothing shameful about honest work, she said. Firmly. Of course not, Richard replied with false sympathy. But it raises questions about your qualifications to lead this institution. After all, your experience is primarily in speculative investments, not community banking. He clicked to another slide. More concerning is your apparent obsession with me and this bank. Your father's business failed 20 years ago after I declined his loan application. Now you've spent a fortune to buy this bank and fire me. The board members turned to Eleanor, their expressions ranging from confusion to suspicion. This isn't leadership, Richard concluded. It's revenge, at the expense of everyone who depends on this bank. Eleanor stood, rage and determination battling within her. Yes, my grandmother claimed this building for 30 years. My father was denied a loan by Mr. Harrington, a decision that contributed to his business failure and subsequent death. I don't deny this history. She connected her laptop to the projector. But let's talk about actual qualifications. Horizon Investments has outperformed market averages for 8 consecutive years. Meanwhile, Heartland National has progressively lost market share in diverse communities under Mr. Harrington's leadership. She opened Martha's files. As for today's stock drop, it's the result of a coordinated campaign by Mr. Harrington and his allies. These emails prove he orchestrated client withdrawals and planted false rumors about regulatory issues. Richard lunged forward. Those are private communications. Illegally obtained. The board members looked between Richard and Eleanor, clearly unsure whom to believe. Gerald Foster stood slowly. Ms. Washington, these are serious allegations on both sides. The board needs time to consider its position. Meanwhile, Richard's attorney interjected, the court has frozen certain executive powers pending review. Ms. Washington cannot make major policy changes or personnel decisions until this matter is resolved. Eleanor felt the ground shifting beneath her. In just 1 hour, Richard had managed to effectively neutralize her authority and plant seeds of doubt about her motives and qualifications. As the board filed out, Richard approached Eleanor. You should have stayed in Chicago, he said quietly. Banking is about relationships and trust. No one here will ever truly trust the cleaning lady's granddaughter who bought a bank for revenge. Eleanor met his gaze. This isn't over. It practically is, Richard replied. By the time the court sorts this out, the damage to your reputation and the bank's will be irreparable. The board will beg me to return. As Eleanor walked alone to her office, employees averted their eyes. News of the confrontation had spread quickly. Her phone buzzed with messages from concerned Chicago colleagues, but she couldn't focus. For the first time since returning to Oak Ridge Springs, Eleanor wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Richard had decades of relationships and influence. He'd managed to turn her greatest strength, her personal connection to the bank's failings, into her greatest vulnerability. Sitting at her desk, Eleanor stared at her grandmother's photo, feeling more alone than ever. Eleanor sat alone in her office as evening fell. The day's humiliation still stung. Richard had outmaneuvered her, leveraging his decades of relationships to turn the board against her. The court injunction prevented her from making any significant changes until a hearing 2 weeks away. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Josiah stood in the doorway, looking uncertain. Ms. Washington? Do you have a minute? Eleanor gestured to a chair. Of course, Josiah. At least you're still talking to me. Most of the staff is confused, not disloyal, he said. Richard's story about your grandmother being the janitor, was that true? Yes. Ida Washington cleaned this bank for 30 years. Never missed a day. Josiah nodded slowly. That's why this matters so much. To you. It's part of it. Eleanor sighed. My father died after Richard denied him a crucial loan. I won't pretend that's not personal. But this is about more than revenge. It's about fixing a broken system. I believe you, Josiah said. And I think I can help. He placed a dusty ledger on her desk. After you promoted me, I started organizing the archive room in the basement. There are records down there going back 50 years that were never digitized. Eleanor flipped through the yellowed pages. Loan applications from the 1990s? Yes. And look at this section. Josiah pointed to a series of entries. These are all from predominantly black neighborhoods, all denied. But the financial qualifications were solid. Eleanor studied the notations. These rejection reasons are ridiculous. Neighborhood declining. Unstable employment sector. These were just excuses. It gets worse, Josiah continued. I found Richard's early performance reviews. His supervisors praised him specifically for protecting bank assets by maintaining strict underwriting standards and changing neighborhoods. Code for redlining, Eleanor said bitterly. Exactly. The discrimination was institutional policy, not just Richard's personal bias. Eleanor turned more pages, then suddenly froze. There, in faded ink, was her father's loan application from 20 years ago. William Washington, hardware store expansion, she read aloud, her voice catching. Projected cash flow sufficient. Business plan solid. Collateral adequate. Yet at the bottom, in Richard's distinctive handwriting, denied. Business owner lacks sophistication for expansion in competitive environment. My father had run that store successfully for 15 years, Eleanor said quietly. He had a business degree. Richard never even gave him a chance. Josiah watched her sympathetically. There's something else you should see. He handed her a stack of more recent files. These are from the last 5 years. All loans to companies connected to Richard's friends on the country club board. Look at the amounts and terms. Eleanor scanned the documents, her eyes widening. These loan amounts far exceed our lending limits. And the interest rates are below our cost of funds. These aren't just preferential, they're barely legal. And look who approved them all. Richard Harrington, Eleanor read. With co-signatures from Gerald Foster and Bradley Thompson. The same board members leading the charge against you, Josiah pointed out. Eleanor's mind raced. Foster and Thompson have been protecting Richard because they're complicit in his schemes. They're not just defending a colleague, they're covering their own misconduct. She stood and began pacing. Josiah, we need to dig deeper. Find every loan connected to board members or their associates. Look for patterns of preferential treatment. Already started, he said, grinning. I've got 3 junior staffers helping me, people who believe in what you're trying to do. For the first time since the disastrous board meeting, Eleanor felt hope rising. But what about the court order? Josiah asked. We can't make any changes until the hearing. We can't change policies, Eleanor corrected. But nothing prevents us from conducting an internal audit. Or from preparing evidence for regulatory authorities. She picked up her father's rejected loan application. Richard thought he could use my personal connection to this bank against me. He doesn't realize that connection is exactly what will give me the strength to see this through. They worked through the night, piecing together decades of discriminatory practices alongside preferential treatment for the wealthy and connected. The pattern was undeniable. At dawn, Eleanor called her legal team in Chicago. I need you to contact the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We have evidence of systematic violations of fair lending practices and potential fraud. After hanging up, she turned to Josiah. The regulators will take weeks or months. We need to move faster. How? The court order limits my executive authority, Eleanor finished. But not my rights as majority shareholder. She pulled out her phone and dialed Martha's number. We need to talk, Eleanor said when Martha answered. I'm giving you one chance to make things right. An hour later, Martha arrived, looking exhausted. "I've been up all night," she admitted. Richard called. "He's planning to use the next shareholders' meeting to force a vote on removing you completely." "He can try," Eleanor said. "But first, I need something from you." "What?" Eleanor slid her father's loan application across the desk. "The truth. You worked here when this was denied." "Did you know my father?" Martha's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the document. "William Washington. Of course I knew him. Everyone loved his hardware store." She looked up at Eleanor. "I never knew Richard denied his loan. Or that he was your father." "Now you do," Eleanor said. "So tell me, Martha, which side of history do you want to be on?" Eleanor barely left the bank for the next 3 days. With Josiah and a small team of loyal employees, she built an airtight case documenting decades of discriminatory lending practices. Meanwhile, her legal team prepared complaints for multiple regulatory agencies. Martha had made her choice. After seeing William Washington's rejected loan application, she provided Eleanor with internal memos and meeting minutes that further implicated Richard and his allies. "David doesn't know I'm doing this," Martha admitted. "He believes his father's version of events." "He needs to know the truth," Eleanor said. "About his father and about you." Martha nodded sadly. "I'll tell him tonight." Eleanor's phone rang. It was her Chicago office. "We've identified 23 former loan applicants who were denied despite meeting all qualifications," her assistant reported. "All from minority neighborhoods. 15 are willing to come forward with their stories." "Perfect," Eleanor replied. "Fly them in for the shareholders' meeting." Richard, meanwhile, continued his campaign. The local business journal ran a profile painting him as the victim of a personal vendetta. Eleanor's stock in Heartland National had dropped another 5%. That evening, Eleanor met with her crisis management team. "We need to change the narrative," she said. "Right now, I'm the outsider trying to take over a community institution. We need to make this about the community members who've been wronged." "How do we do that with the court order restricting your actions?" asked her PR director. "I can't change bank policy yet, but nothing stops me from meeting with community members. Let's organize a public forum. Invite everyone who's been denied loans over the years. Let them tell their stories." The forum was hastily arranged at a church in the predominantly black West Side neighborhood. Eleanor expected perhaps 50 people. Over 300 showed up. One by one, residents shared experiences of loan denials despite solid qualifications. Small business owners described watching their white counterparts receive funding for similar ventures. Homebuyers recalled being steered away from certain mortgage products without explanation. Unknown to Eleanor, a local news crew filmed the entire event. By morning, clips were playing on every channel. Community members voiced decades of frustration with Heartland National Bank practices, the anchors reported. New owner Eleanor Washington vows changes despite legal challenges. Richard was livid when he saw the coverage. He called an emergency meeting with his allies. "She's turning public opinion against us," he fumed. "We need to accelerate our timeline." "The shareholders' meeting is still 10 days away," Bradley Thompson reminded him. "That's too long. She's building momentum. We need to act now." The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the bank to find Martha waiting anxiously. "Richard's calling in loans," she said without preamble. "What?" "Several large commercial loans approved under special terms for Richard's associates. The bank has discretionary call provisions. Bradley Thompson is preparing the notices today." Eleanor frowned. That would create immediate cash flow problems for those businesses. "Exactly. They'll blame you and your risky management style. It's another attempt to damage your reputation. Can we stop it?" Martha shook her head. "The loan committee approved it last night. They claimed it's a routine risk management measure, not a policy change, so it doesn't violate the court order." Eleanor thought quickly. Who are the affected businesses? Martha handed her a list. Eleanor scanned it, then smiled. Perfect. These are all Richard's country club friends. The same ones who received preferential treatment for years. Why is that perfect? Martha asked. Because it gives me leverage. Eleanor picked up her phone. Josiah, I need you to pull the complete files on these businesses. Every document, every approval, every term sheet. By noon, Eleanor had what she needed. She began making calls to each business owner on the list. Mr. Caldwell? Eleanor Washington. I understand you received a loan call notice this morning. Yes, I know it's creating difficulties. I'd like to invite you to my office to discuss options. One by one, the angry business owners arrived. In private meetings, Eleanor showed them evidence of how their loans had violated bank policies. These special terms were technically improper, she explained to each one. If challenged by regulators, these agreements could be deemed fraudulent. Are you threatening me? Demanded James Caldwell, owner of a large commercial real estate firm. Not at all. I'm offering a solution. Eleanor handed him a folder. This is a proper loan agreement. Standard terms, appropriate interest rate, proper documentation. Sign this, and your loan won't be called. This rate is higher than what Richard gave me. This rate is legal and fair. It's what everyone else pays. By the end of the day, 7 of the 9 business owners had signed new, legitimate loan agreements. Eleanor had effectively neutralized Richard's attempt to create a cash flow crisis while simultaneously converting improper loans into proper ones. When Richard learned what had happened, he was furious. She's turning my own allies against me, he shouted at Bradley Thompson. How did she even know about the loan calls? The answer came that evening when Martha publicly resigned her position, releasing a statement that she could no longer in good conscience support practices that harm the communities we serve. Eleanor's phone rang late that night. It was David Harrington. My mother told me everything, he said without greeting. About her relationship with my father. About his lending practices. About what he did to your father. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, Eleanor said. I've spent my career trying to distance myself from him while still seeking his approval, David said bitterly. What a waste. It's never too late to choose a different path. There was a long pause. The shareholders meeting next week. Richard expects me to speak against you. To use my position on the city council to question your fitness to run the bank. And will you? No, David said firmly. I'll be telling a different story entirely. The day of the shareholders' meeting arrived with tension hanging in the air. Security was tight as shareholders filed into Heartland National's main conference center. Eleanor watched from a side room, mentally reviewing her strategy one final time. They're all here, Josiah reported, peeking through the door. Richard's sitting up front with his allies. Looks confident. Let him enjoy it while it lasts, Eleanor replied. Media had gathered outside. Drawn by rumors of a showdown between the bank's controversial new owner and its former manager. The story had grown beyond Oak Ridge Springs, with national business outlets covering what they called a battle for the soul of community banking. Minutes before the meeting, Martha Jenkins arrived with her son David. Richard approached them immediately. What are you doing here? He hissed at Martha. And David, we agreed you'd sit with me. Plans have changed, Dad, David replied coolly. Before Richard could respond, the meeting was called to order. Gerald Foster, as board chairman, took the podium. Today we face an unprecedented situation, Foster began. Just months ago, Heartland National was a stable, respected institution. Now we face declining stock values, customer uncertainty, and leadership turmoil. Murmurs spread through the crowd as Foster continued. Ms. Washington's acquisition of this bank was technically legal but raises serious ethical questions. Her subsequent actions suggest a personal vendetta rather than sound business judgment. Eleanor sat impassively as Foster introduced Richard Harrington to share his perspective as the bank's longtime leader. Richard approached the podium to scattered applause. For 25 years, I guided this bank with one principle: financial stability first, Richard began. Banking isn't a social experiment. It's about responsible management of other people's money. He clicked through slides showing the bank's growth during his tenure. Ms. Washington claims our practices were discriminatory. I call them prudent. Every denied loan represented genuine risk assessment, not bias. Eleanor noticed several audience members shifting uncomfortably. I'm not asking you to reinstate me, Richard continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. I'm asking you to examine whether Ms. Washington's personal crusade serves the interests of this institution and its shareholders. Foster returned to the podium. We'll now hear from Eleanor Washington. As Eleanor rose, the doors at the back of the hall opened. In walked the 23 loan applicants her team had flown in, business owners, homebuyers, and entrepreneurs from underserved communities who had been improperly denied loans over the years. The audience turned to watch as they filed in silently, taking seats reserved in the back. Eleanor walked slowly to the podium, making eye contact with Richard before beginning. Mr. Foster spoke of ethical questions surrounding my acquisition of this bank. Let me address those directly. She paused, scanning the room. Yes, I bought this bank after building a successful investment firm. Yes, I fired Richard Harrington on my first day. And yes, it was partly personal. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Richard smirked. My grandmother cleaned this building for 30 years. My father was denied a crucial business loan by Mr. Harrington 20 years ago, contributing to his business failure and subsequent fatal heart attack. Eleanor placed her father's denied loan application on the projector. But this isn't just my story. It's the story of hundreds of qualified applicants who were denied fair access to capital based on their race, neighborhood, or lack of country club connections. She gestured to the people seated in the back. These individuals all met or exceeded Heartland's stated loan qualifications. All were denied. All come from minority neighborhoods. Next, she displayed the evidence of preferential treatment for Richard's associates: loans exceeding limits, below-market interest rates, inadequate collateral requirements. This isn't prudent banking. It's privileged banking for some, prejudiced banking for others. Richard stood. This is slander. These are cherry-picked examples taken out of context. I have documentation for every case, Eleanor replied calmly. As do the regulatory agencies who received our complaints yesterday. Richard paled as she continued. But today isn't about punishing past wrongs. It's about choosing our future path. Eleanor revealed her plan to transform Heartland National into a true community bank with transparent practices, fair lending standards, and specialized programs for underserved areas. I'm not asking you to choose me over Richard Harrington, she concluded. I'm asking you to choose a more inclusive, ethical vision of banking over an outdated model that served few at the expense of many. Foster attempted to regain control. Thank you, Ms. Washington. Now, as previously arranged, we have a statement from City Councilman David Jenkins. Richard smiled, expecting his son's support. His expression froze as David approached the podium. Most of you know me as David Jenkins, but I'm also David Harrington, he began. Richard Harrington is my father. Gasps filled the room. Richard half rose from his seat. I've recently learned truths about my father's banking practices that I cannot ignore or excuse, David continued. Including the fact that for years, he falsified documentation to provide preferential treatment to wealthy associates while systematically excluding qualified minority applicants. This is outrageous. Richard shouted, fully standing now. My own son Dash is finally telling the truth, Martha Jenkins said, standing beside her son. As am I. I witnessed these practices for years and remained silent out of fear and misplaced loyalty. Foster banged his gavel. This is most irregular - what's irregular, Eleanor interrupted, is that board members like yourself, Mr. Foster, were complicit in these practices. These documents show your approval of numerous improper loans. The room erupted in chaos. Shareholders called for immediate votes. Reporters scribbled furiously. Richard, face flushed with rage and humiliation, stormed toward Eleanor. "You've destroyed everything," he seethed. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "No, Richard. You did that yourself, one denied loan at a time." When order was finally restored, the shareholders voted overwhelmingly to maintain Eleanor's leadership and approve her new vision for the bank. Richard watched from the back, alone, as his former allies distanced themselves to save their own reputations. As the meeting adjourned, one of the previously denied loan applicants approached Eleanor. "Today doesn't fix 20 years of being told we don't belong," the woman said. "But it's a start." Eleanor nodded. "Just a start. But an important one." 1 year had passed since the dramatic shareholders' meeting that had changed Heartland National Bank forever. The spring sun shone brightly as a crowd gathered outside the Westside branch for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Eleanor Washington stood at the podium, taking in the transformed building. Once slated for closure under Richard's leadership, the branch had been completely renovated and expanded into the Ida Washington Community Financial Center. "My grandmother used to say that true change happens slowly, then all at once," Eleanor began, addressing the crowd of community members, employees, and media. "When I came back to Oak Ridge Springs a year ago, I couldn't have imagined how true those words would prove to be. The past year had been challenging but transformative. Regulatory investigations into Richard Harrington's practices had resulted in significant fines for the bank but had also validated Eleanor's claims. Several board members, including Gerald Foster, had resigned rather than face potential charges. Heartland National stock had initially plummeted further after the scandal broke but had steadily climbed as Eleanor's new policies took effect. The bank was now posting record numbers of new accounts from previously underserved communities. "Today, we're not just reopening a branch," Eleanor continued. "We're celebrating a new approach to community banking. One that recognizes that good business and ethical practices aren't opposing forces, they're complementary." Strengths. The new center included traditional banking services alongside financial literacy workshops, small business development resources, and a dedicated microloan program for local entrepreneurs. The building itself had been redesigned with input from community members to be more welcoming and accessible. As Eleanor prepared to cut the ribbon, she noticed a familiar figure at the edge of the crowd. Richard Harrington stood alone, watching the ceremony. He looked older, thinner, his once commanding presence diminished. The federal investigation into his banking practices had concluded just last week with a settlement that included a lifetime ban from the banking industry. Eleanor nodded slightly in his direction, neither triumphant nor vindictive. Richard held her gaze for a moment, then turned and walked away. After the ceremony, Eleanor gave tours of the new facility. The last stop was her favorite wall displaying photographs of Westside residents who had received loans to start or expand businesses over the past year. 62 new businesses launched, nearly 200 jobs created, she explained to the visitors. "That's not charity. That's unlocking potential that was always here." As the crowd dispersed, Martha and David approached Eleanor. "Quite a transformation," Martha said, looking around the bright, modern space. "In more ways than one," Eleanor replied. "How's the new job?" After resigning from Heartland, Martha had taken a position leading a nonprofit focused on financial education for women. "It's where I should have been all along," Martha said. "Using my banking knowledge to actually help people." David shook Eleanor's hand. "The City Council approved the expansion of your small business grant program. We're matching the bank's contribution." "That's wonderful news," Eleanor said. "And how are things with my father?" David sighed. "Complicated. He refuses to acknowledge any wrongdoing. Still believes he was the victim in all this. But I've made my peace with who he is. After they left, Eleanor remained behind. The office that had once been Richard's, then briefly hers, now housed the community lending team. She wandered through the space, watching the diverse group of employees assisting customers. Her assistant approached with a young black woman in tow. "Ms. Washington? This is Shanice Davis. She's here about a business loan for her bakery." Of course, Eleanor smiled. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your business plan was impressive." Shanice looked surprised. "You read it yourself?" "I try to review as many applications as I can," Eleanor explained, guiding her to a comfortable meeting area. "Especially first-time entrepreneurs." As they discussed Shanice's plans for her bakery, Eleanor saw the same determination in the young woman's eyes that she'd once seen in her father's. But unlike her father, Shanice wouldn't be summarily dismissed by someone who couldn't see her potential. After approving the loan on the spot, Eleanor handed Shanice a handwritten note along with the official paperwork. "What's this?" Shanice asked. "Just a reminder," Eleanor said. "Something I write to all our first-time business owners." After Shanice left, Eleanor walked to her small personal office in the back. Unlike Richard's imposing executive space, hers was modest and practical. On the wall hung two photographs side by side, her grandmother Ida in her cleaning uniform, and her father standing proudly in front of his hardware store. Between them sat a framed dollar bill, the first dollar earned by the revitalized West Side branch. Eleanor touched the frame gently. "We did it, Grandma. We did it, Dad." She looked out the window at the bustling community she'd grown up in, now showing signs of renewal that went beyond just the bank. New businesses were opening, homes were being renovated, and there was an energy that hadn't existed before. Richard had tried to use her connection to Ida against her, to paint her as an outsider consumed by revenge. He never understood that her grandmother's legacy wasn't a weakness, it was her greatest strength. It had given her the perspective to see what banking could be when it served everyone, not just the privileged few. As Eleanor turned back to her desk to review more loan applications, she knew the work was far from over. Change came slowly, then all at once, and then required constant vigilance to maintain. But for the first time since returning to Oak Ridge Springs, she felt she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Not just righting an old wrong, but creating something new and better in its place. The hidden worth of her family's legacy had finally been revealed, not just to her, but to an entire community that was now writing a new chapter of its own.